Alrighty then. Good afternoon. Looks like we are not remotely all here. The wind, maybe it's too windy. Couldn't make it. What we'll do is review very quickly from last time our discussion of Descartes. Then get into still in theories of knowledge, still dealing with epistemology, but in this case with John Locke, moving into empiricism. So we left off last time with Descartes. We finished with Descartes. I want to review briefly because his argument may have been a little bit confusing. Then we'll stop about 12 minutes before we're supposed to let out, and there'll be a small quiz over the material from last time and today. Normal size quiz, 8.5 by 11, but it's short. I'm playing off of the ambiguity of small quiz. It's normal size paper. Do you have a question? I'm sorry? No, I don't have one. Is there one in the back? I bet is that one right there? Pencil sharpener? Is that a pencil sharpener? Yeah. Then there is, way in the back.
Who gets paid to empty those?
Who gets paid? It hasn't been emptied since 1935. So there's some really cool pencil shavings probably in there, which you're just now adding your own to it. All right, so today, what I say? Let's review very quickly. So I won't do the roll. I'm going to use the quiz later on as the roll for today. So last week we looked at Descartes' argument for a belief or a foundation for his knowledge. He was looking for something that couldn't be doubted. Right? This is not Locke. In fact, don't look at that. Don't look at that. I don't want to confuse. Last class I was talking for like 20 minutes reviewing Descartes. And people were writing down notes saying, this is what Locke felt. I totally messed that up, so forget about Locke for a second. Descartes was looking for a claim or a belief that could hold up his web of beliefs or a system of beliefs that couldn't be doubted. He was looking for a belief that was what? What's that word for it couldn't be doubted? Indubitable. Anyone use that over the weekend? You get a chance to do it? Oh, well, you're in the class. That doesn't really work. Oh. Well, did you use it in front of people who are not in the class?
Fred was trying, they were like arguing something or debating something, and he was like, what was that an dubious claim?
Oh, yeah, that's not the word. There's a different dispute within here. I won't get into that. But indubitable. And you asked, is that an indubitable claim, to which they said?
He didn't know what I was talking about.
Well, then you had an opportunity to explain it.
I tried to explain it to him, yeah. He's pretty hard-headed guy, though. And
did you get into a fight with him? Fist fight?
No, this is like less than that.
That's probably best. Anyway, use the word sparingly, but I want to get it to be back into the lexicon, so to speak. So Descartes, looking for that indubitable belief. What is the indubitable belief he gets to? Yes?
I can think I exist.
That's right. So Descartes, as an existing thing, as a thinking thing exists. All thinking things are existing things. And from that one claim, he can build back all that he had thrown out. What did he throw out? He threw out all claims to knowledge based on the senses. Why did he throw all that out? Because he was looking for certainty. And since your senses, your 5 senses, can never give you 100% certainty, we all know they've made mistakes in the past. We've erred with respect to senses. We think we see the stick bent in the water. We think we see water in the distance. It's a hallucination. The phantom limb examples, and so on. Since there's the possibility of error with our senses, we throw out all the beliefs we have that came from our senses. He's not a skeptic. Keep that in mind. I was going to ask you that. Is Descartes a skeptic? The answer is no. He's refuting the skeptics using, what does he use? That weird word in English? Meaning exaggeration? Hyperbole or hyperbolic doubt or methodological skepticism. He is not a skeptic. He's using the methods of skepticism to peel away all that can be doubted till he gets to an indubitable truth from which he can build everything back. That he has now justification. He doubted everything that came in from the senses. That means he could doubt whether you all exist and whether himself exists as a body, because we only know of bodies by our senses. Since that's susceptible to potential doubt without contradiction or absurdity, it can be thrown out, and the skeptics still have, so to speak, a foothold. He can doubt whether he's Descartes or someone else. Is he insane? Is that logically possible? Of course it is. Is he asleep or dreaming? Can you tell the difference? You've all had false awakenings, perhaps at least once in your life. If there are false awakenings, and you cannot tell the difference in those moments between waking state and dream state, it's logically possible that all of this is a false awakening, so to speak. And we cannot tell the difference between waking state and dreaming state, which means all that we think we know, we don't. Then he imagines that potentially God has deceived him. Because even when you're dreaming, or even if your senses are flawed, 2 plus 2 still equals 4. Unless that also can be doubted by God, let's say. He only does that briefly because, why? Why does he only briefly doubt God?
Because it'd be dangerous to do so.
At that time, it was dangerous to publicly doubt the existence of God. He knew what happened to contemporaries of his who were treated harshly, let's say, to the extent of being burned alive in some cases. So he instead says it's not God that's a deceiver, but an evil demon or an evil genius that's fooled him into thinking mathematics is as we've been taught. That's fooled him into thinking he exists, when in fact he doesn't. Notice it's not fooling him into thinking he has a body. It's fooling him into thinking he exists as a thinking thing, as a mind. Now why is that not, in fact, logically possible? Whereas all the other doubting was acceptable, was logically possible. You can doubt all that comes in from your senses, you can doubt that you're waking or dreaming, and so forth, but you cannot doubt your own existence. Why can't you do that without absurdity?
You can't fool something that doesn't exist.
You cannot fool something that doesn't exist. Did I give you the example of me being the evil genius and Descartes being over there? And I'd say to you all, hey friends, look at Descartes, the idiot thinks he exists. I fooled him. He doesn't exist. Well, if that were accurate representation of what was happening, then I wouldn't be pointing to anything because Descartes wouldn't exist. And Descartes wouldn't be a fool because if you don't exist, you can't have thoughts to be foolish. And you can't have doubts either. If you're truly a non-existent thing, including not a mind at all, then there's no capacity for thinking if there's no mind. And therefore there'd be no capacity for doubting. But the very fact that we can doubt our own existence entails that we must exist. Because to doubt is to think. And to think is to exist, as you said, his famous, I think, therefore I am. All thinking things exist. If I think, therefore I exist. Then he has to build back. So that's the fundamental claim. That's the foundation where he can build everything back up. And it's a very high bar for justification. How do I know something? It's either an indubitable truth that can't be doubted. It's a clear and distinct idea. What's the other phrase for clear and distinct that you might know better? Self-evident. Self-evident in that when you hear the concepts and understand the words, no further evidence is needed. If you have a belief up here, it's held up by these other beliefs. Accept it if it is itself self-evident or clear and distinct. If it's not, then find something that holds it up. And if that's not, find something that holds that until you get to a foundation that is an indubitable truth that cannot be doubted. That it would be a contradiction or an absurdity to say it's not true. And remember, self-evident is kind of like understanding the concepts of a bachelor. What is a bachelor? It's, by definition, an unmarried male of marrying age. A triangle is, by definition, a three-sided figure having interior angles equal 180 degrees. Once you understand those concepts, you don't need further argument to justify that claim. Once you understand what a thinking substance is, once you understand what it means to think, you understand that to think is to exist. That is self-evident. And it holds up all these other beliefs. Remember again, we talked about self-evident in the sense of we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, on it goes. Remember, Descartes would not think of those claims as self-evident. Because to assume a creator, to assume that we're created assumes that there is a creator. About to drink from that. That's a coin. Oh, that's a nice jug. These are really nice. If you want one, it's right here. It's got water in it still. It's like $50 or something. Ridiculous. Those water bottles. Probably just take it and wash it if you want it. Just leave it there. If it's yours. Okay. So self-evident. It is not self-evident that God exists. Remember this? If it were self-evident, it would be as obvious to everyone that God exists as it is that a bachelor is an unmarried male of marrying age. We all agree with that. There's little dispute about that. There aren't different factions of people getting around saying, no, this is not what bachelor means. This is the definition. We don't have that with religion and beliefs in God. That's not self-evident as evidenced by the multitude of different approaches, different beliefs. So, Descartes has a very high bar for what counts as knowledge. Perhaps too high a bar. In fact, rationalists in general, according to people like John Locke, place way too high a condition for there to be justification for our true beliefs, that it leads to ultimately skepticism. It leads to us not having knowledge at all. Because if we need to be certain about something, then we're not going to have knowledge, because there's so few things that we are certain of the sort Descartes was looking for. And remember, what else does this I think, therefore I am tell us about the world? Do you remember this? I briefly went over this example, it's not key for us here. I'm mostly interested in you knowing the argument, how he gets to his indubitable truth. But remember, he builds everything else back up. From the indubitable truth that he exists, he's able to bring back the existence of his body, the idea that he's awake, the difference between a waking state and a dream state, the idea that there is a God that's not a deceiver, and therefore our senses are not flawed. But he has to use some unique medieval principles to make that case. I think I briefly talked about that. Just to review, Descartes knows he exists as a thinking thing, and he knows he has thoughts. And those thoughts come from somewhere, either himself or the world around him. And somehow he has an idea of perfection. Do you remember this? Where did the idea of perfection come from? Well, according to medieval scholars, there's something called the causal adequacy principle, CAP, which says causes must have as much or greater powers than their effects. The way Descartes talks about the thought of perfection is to see it as an effect. If he didn't cause the idea of perfection, because he couldn't cause it, because he's not perfect, and if nothing in the world is perfect, that means nothing in the world could have caused the idea in his mind of perfection, right? What does that lead to? The idea of perfection had to come from
Somewhere not in this world.
something not in this world, and something as good or better than perfection. What's as good or better than perfection? Starts with a G, ends in D. There's an O in the middle.
Dogs.
Dogs?
I said God.
Oh, God is correct. Dogs is correct if you're... Yeah, somebody said it. I won't. But yes, God. And therefore, if God exists and God is all perfect, he has another argument for that, then God wouldn't create us with deceptive senses and so forth. Go ahead.
Isn't perfect kind of subjective though?
Yeah, that's a problem. We'll come back to that with Anselm. Although he'll try to argue it's not. A perfect being that has perfect knowledge, everyone can come to an agreement on what that is. A perfect hot fudge sundae, I don't know. I used to wait tables, and I remember serving a sundae. And I asked, how was your sundae? And it was like all over her face. It was disgusting. She said, oh, it was perfection. And I was aware of philosophy at the time, because I was, taking classes. And I wanted to say, no, you're wrong. This is not a matter of subjectivity. This sundae is a mess, and you look awful, which is irrelevant to the sundae itself. But I could imagine a better sundae, namely one that didn't have you don't put fruit in ice cream, okay? So already that's a strike against you for asking for a cherry. She wanted 2 cherries, or 3, and it's all this glop, what is it? Terrible, disgusting stuff in there. Anyway, that goes to your point. A perfect hot fudge sundae is going to be different from person to person. But I want to come back to that when we get to Anselm later on. I don't know why that exhausted me. So, Locke, John Locke, very famous philosopher, English philosopher, he wrote the text that you have today. We'll look at more readings from his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, or Essay Human Understanding, excuse me. It's a massive text that gets at all areas of understanding, basically, from his perspective. He's trying to figure out what the limits of human knowledge are. And importantly, Locke is a empiricist, probably because he's trained as a medical doctor. He was the private physician to the Earl of Shaftesbury because he saved his life. And he was so impressed with that, he said, "You're going to be my private physician." And he was also a philosopher. And it's not surprising that as a physician, trained medical doctor, he's going to be interested in knowledge that's usable in the world. I know this is how I'm going to stop the bleeding. He's not going to sit around and wait, like Descartes did, for perfect certainty, as his patient is bleeding out on the table. He's going to look for answers in the real world based upon experience. And there's going to be some limitations to that, as we'll see. In the beginning of the text, which you don't have, this is the introduction of this text, he says, "My purpose here, therefore, is to inquire into the origin, certainty, and extent of human knowledge, and also into the grounds and degrees of belief, opinion, and assent." What he means is, or rather, this whole book came out of these interminable disputes he has with friends and family members over ethics, over religion, over politics, metaphysics, and so on, that seem to go in circles without there being an answer. And because of that constant turmoil that comes out of those kinds of disputes, Locke was looking for some grounding of our claims to knowledge. And he has a kind of, as he puts it, a humble goal, where his job is to clear away the conceptual confusion, a lot having to do with language, so that scientists can go forward and determine what counts as knowledge. What do we know about the world? He was very much influenced by the science of his day, in particular Isaac Newton. In fact, he was so much influenced by Newton, he became what Newton was, and we'll talk about this later, a corpuscularian, which is a fantastic phrase, although no one's a corpuscularian anymore. The idea that corpuscles, physical things that are too small for us to perceive, are nevertheless what cause us to have perceptions. It's all physical. It's all experiential. Think of corpuscles as atoms today or something like that. We'll come back to that. Skipping that slide. So, how is it that Locke is going to make his empiricist take on knowledge? How is it that we come to know? It's all right there. Pretty straightforward. It's actually one source. All the material of our knowledge is supplied by sense perception and introspection. Sense data. Your five senses. Think of it in those terms. Not just perception in the sense of visual, although that's what we always associate. Think of perception with your five senses. And then what's introspection? Anyone? Introspection?
Is it like your metacognition, like thinking of like what's going on, like the stuff that goes on in your brain that you don't perceive from the world, but it's thinking about what you have perceived?
Exactly. Thinking about what you have perceived. Did you want to add to
Self-reflection.
And self-reflection is another way of saying that. It's exactly right. So I can only have ideas in my head to think about if at some point I've experienced something related to them. And I can close my eyes and think about the ideas that I've received from my experiences. It's just that I'm once removed from the external world when I do that. There's nothing magical about introspection. Excuse me. It's self-cognition or metacognition. It's thinking about my thinking. But the thoughts can only be possible if at some point along that process there was an experience in the world with my five senses, right? There has to have been some connection to the world through our five senses. And introspection is simply putting together those ideas. And this is the method of reasoning that Locke is going to be primarily concerned with. As we discussed with tools of philosophers, particularly with logic, we remember deduction and induction, the kind of reasoning that Descartes engaged in was primarily deductive, a priori, prior to experience. Whereas the type of reasoning that Locke is interested in and using most of the time is a posteriori, which I realize I don't think I have up there, so let me write it. Post meaning after, experience. We make predictions with science, we make analogies, generalizations, and we make argument about causes and effects. Those are all inductive inferences. And those are the predominant types of reasoning in all of the sciences. Medical sciences, detective work, forensics, and so forth. Diseases and all that. And since we're interested in knowledge as useful in the real world, in particular Locke is, because as a medical doctor he wants to be able to claim to have knowledge about human body and so on. Descartes' presumed demand for perfect certainty is problematic. Because anytime we don't get perfect certainty, Locke's concerned, that means we don't have knowledge? That's a really strong claim. And that seems to be a claim that would support skeptics. That would support the idea that knowledge is impossible because the bar is set too high. So Locke is not going to discount the use of reason. He's not going to discount that we can reason about mathematics and we can make deductive proofs based on certain logical laws. He's not going to discount that. Reason still plays a role in our lives, just as rationalists accept that experience clearly plays a role. But experience for the rationalist is never sufficient for justification. Think again of Plato's cave. Think of Descartes with respect to the perceptions being susceptible to error. But Locke is going to say that all of those presumed universal principles are something, require experience. It isn't something that we get by virtue of just being born into the world. And it's for this reason that Locke, and we anticipated this discussion already, Locke is concerned with this idea that some rationalists, in their varying degrees of this, accept as necessary for knowledge, that we have already, like pre-programmed computers to some extent, have built-in knowledge. And Locke ultimately claims that to invoke this, and he kind of assumes it's like a supernatural thing, that it's innate, it's not from the natural world. It comes with us, so to speak. The Platonic realm, or something like that, seems beyond the natural, not supernatural in the sense of ESP or powers like that, or superhero powers, but just simply beyond the natural. He finds that to be insufficient. In fact, he's totally against innate principles as an empiricist, because of course knowledge is impossible unless we have experience. Innate principles presume we have certain knowledge without experience. What would be an example, however, that you might consider innate knowledge that humans do have? Yeah.
How to breathe.
What is it?
How to breathe.
Innate knowledge, how to breathe. Is that knowledge? Yeah. I guess even babies come out breathing. Well, unless they're not breathing. Then they have to be spanked or whatever. So they know how to breathe. Well, let's think about that. Yes?
Heart beating?
You know how to have your heart beat?
Your brain knows how to.
Your brain does. Your brain knows how to make your heart beat. Is that knowledge? I mean, imagine, what if I didn't know that? My heart stopped. Does your heart stop because you have a lack of knowledge? Why did he die? He was ignorant of how his heart... And he died of ignorance. What do you mean? Well, his heart stopped. What the hell does that mean? He didn't know how to keep his heart going. I guess. But that's good. That's an interesting... Both your examples are an interesting conception of knowledge. We see other...
It's like continuation of that. It's like all our cells know exactly what to do. Like
All our what?
all our cells know exactly what to do before we're born. And like I'm just wondering if he considers that like kind of like a supernatural thing that happens like when we're born, and like everything in our body, not even knowledge, but like everything in our body already knows what to do.
That's interesting. It knows what to do. This was prior to genetics, so he would be unaware of this science. If he were alive today, he would look at this and say, that's fascinating, but it isn't knowledge. I accept that we're born with certain genetic predispositions, he might say. I'm guessing. I don't know what the hell he would say about this, but I bet he wouldn't call that knowledge of the sort he's interested
Like, he
in.
would still stand by, I mean, not that you know, but he would sort of still stand by that his heart kept beating and his lungs worked, but that's different.
That's not knowledge. That's right. I think that's what he would say. And I'll come back to the cases in a moment to see what I mean.
We know how to like communicate, like from the time we're born, we know to like make a noise, another human will like pay attention to us if they're around.
Do you remember that as an infant?
No.
And do the infants know what they're doing? When they cry, they look around. Why am I not getting the nipple? Where the hell's the milk? I know what I'll do. Last time I cried, they came right to me. I'm going to do that again. Maybe they do. But of course, we don't remember that because our brains aren't developed enough to retain memories. But is that knowledge? Even if it were, is that what they're doing? Is it knowledge? Did you want to add to that?
Well, I would think that works, but I was gonna say like seeing or like looking around.
We know how to perceive. Yeah, babies look around. They know how to do it. They reach out for things, like the nipple. That's all they do. That's all they know. That's all they care about. Yes, and then we'll move on.
Babies like know how to smile, don't they?
I don't know.
Knowing how to do something.
They do. They call that invisible imitation. Because when the mother smiles at the baby, then the baby will smile.
What about when people like laugh and then cry though?
And the same thing, and babies will laugh, or sometimes if you laugh at them, that's too much, and they'll cry. At least they know how to cry. But they don't even know they have a face, so they don't know how to smile. It's not like it's know-how. That gets to different kinds of knowledge. I know that, and that's primarily the kind of knowledge that epistemologists have been interested in up until the 20th century. Now we're getting more into interesting distinctions here. Like I know how, which is getting at what a lot of you are talking about. What was the other hand? Yes.
I was going to say needs for hunger and thirst.
No, what was it?
But like needs for hunger and thirst, people are born with those. Like they somehow know like when they need something to eat or something.
Yeah. Is that knowledge or is that, what's another word for that? Feelings of hunger. Seeking food.
It's a sensation.
A sensation. What is it?
Instinct.
Instinct. Is instinct knowledge? I don't know. I mean, I used to... What is that? You know that game that idiots played where you would swing at somebody's face and if they flinched, you were then allowed to punch them twice? You know what I'm talking about? 2 for flinching, I think they called it. It's not knowledge, really. It's just a reaction. And babies would flinch too if you were to... They'll test this. They'll say, it's a newborn. Can I just, for a second, I want to learn in philosophy, and then just swing at the baby. And if it flinches, I'm spitting all over the place. If it flinches, sorry, I think that was over this way. Then it shows you, does the baby know, or is that mere instinct? And Locke, I think again, going to a lot of the other discussions, if Locke were out today, he'd probably call that instinct, and instinct doesn't reach the level of knowledge, certainly not of knowledge that. I know that P, and P is the proposition. Subject knows that, and that's in a sort of propositional form. It's, I know that this table is comprised of subatomic particles, and I can justify that with certain claims. Think of it in terms of true, justified belief. Once you define knowledge that way, what kind of knowledge are we born with? What kind of true, justified beliefs do infants have? Put another way, what kind of beliefs do infants have? That is an interesting question.
I think we know that we exist when we're born, or else we wouldn't cry for food or be super cute, so parents won't kill them. Like that's why they're
Wait,
cute.
they know to be cute?
Well, like they know to cry if something's hurting them. They know how to. They just know that they need to survive. So I personally
Do they
think
know
therefore
that?
they know that they exist.
They don't have to know that in like belief form, like I exist, because that implies having language.
They wouldn't have those instincts like we have instincts to run away when something's scary, fight or flight. Yeah. Because like we know we exist, so therefore we have instincts. So I think babies, because
Okay.
they have instincts, they also know that on some level it exists.
Okay, that's knowledge then. They're born with that. That's interesting. Oh, wait, there's another hand first. Yes, and then you.
Well, now that I'm thinking about it, I guess they're not born with it, but like that there's a caretaker, like the mother, they know that that's their mother or their caretaker.
But notice the difference of knowledge. You have three different senses. I know that. That's the true justified belief. I know how. Doesn't that seem like a different kind of knowledge? I know how to ride a bike is different than I know that riding a bike requires this kind of physics or something. I know how to catch a baseball is very different than I know that catching a baseball involves this mathematics, for example. Dogs know how to catch frisbees. That doesn't mean they have the underlying mathematics involved in that. And if I know a person, that's knowledge by acquaintance. Those are three different senses of knowledge. Primarily, philosophers like Locke, Descartes, and Socrates and so forth are dealing with knowledge that what counts as a justified belief. And it requires having beliefs, and it's unclear that infants would have beliefs. Although some of the examples you reference, perhaps maybe we should expand on what we take a belief to be. Can you have beliefs that don't necessarily have to be put in terms of words? And you'd have to do that if you're going to accept that infants have beliefs, because they don't have words yet, right? So that would mean beliefs don't have to be put in terms of language. And maybe that's the case. Locke doesn't like this idea, and there's a lot here. You don't need to write all of that down. And this is his language, by the way. He says, look, some people argue that there must be innate ideas or innate principles or innate knowledge because of this notion that we just universally agree with or consent. We all accept certain laws of reasoning, like the law of excluded middle, the law of identity, or for our purposes to focus on here, since we know this one, the law of non-contradiction. Everyone knows these and agrees with it. Therefore, they must be innate, prior to experience. To which Locke says, nonsense. What about children, idiots, and illiterate and savage? These are all his words. The savages, I think he's referring to indigenous populations in the Americas and elsewhere. Locke, he had some problems. Was a brilliant philosopher, had a lot to say about ethics and politics and so forth, but he benefited greatly from the slave trade, and he knew what he was benefiting from. It would be absurd to say otherwise. So that's a huge problem, which we'll get to later on. But his point here is that innate ideas are absurd. Even if it were true that we all had universal consent, which, by the way, we don't. We don't all agree, and he should have known this. We don't all agree that the law of non-contradiction is actually a law of thinking, that it is in fact infallible, so to speak. There are exceptions to at least that notion of consent. Not everyone agrees about it. Very few people in Western traditions do, but in Buddhist traditions, in Jain traditions, in Eastern philosophy, the law of non-contradiction doesn't always hold. There are exceptions. Some claims can be both true and false at the same time, which violates the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. And some contemporary philosophers, a guy named Graham Priest as an example, argues through what's known as para-consistent logic, says there are certain claims that can be both true and false at the same time. Or true, but not false, or false but not true, all at the same time, such as the liar paradox. Everything I say is a lie. Well, that seems to be both true and false at the same time. I'm not getting into all that right now. I'm just saying there is not universal consent. So they can't be innate. And Locke argues, even if there were universal consent, that would not imply that it's innate. We don't come into the world universally consenting to the definition of what a bachelor is. We have to learn that. We have to experience, in some sense, what these concepts mean. And so even things that are universally consented to, we all agree that they mean this or they are that, that still requires experience to some extent. And that is why he oftentimes refers to the state of the mind prior to experience as a blank slate. It doesn't come with anything on it, like a computer might come pre-programmed with certain kinds of information, I guess you'd say. And again, this is a very interesting question about what Locke would say today with respect to genetics. Again, I think that genetic predisposition is different than knowledge. It's simply something we're born with, but that's not obviously knowledge. So what does his mind look like at birth? It's right there. It's a blank slate, you see? There's nothing there. And it is experience of the world that inscribes upon our minds. Whoa, what happened? So, this thing sometimes apparently doesn't work. Where are we? I did that. So here's where we're going to be. How is it that we then come to know anything? If it isn't by having innate ideas or knowledge within us prior to coming into the world, how is it that things in the world then can grant us knowledge? If it's through experience, then it's our five senses that access reality. How can objects do that? In order to make sense of this empiricist approach, we need to get a sense of some of his language. How do we get ideas in our heads to begin with?
Could you say that we're born knowing how to learn things?
That wouldn't be knowledge either. I think a contemporary guy named Steven Pinker, who we'll look at maybe next class or the class after that with his theories on language, would say that we have the language instinct, or we have an instinct to learn a given language. So you put us in the proper environments, let's say in an English-speaking home or Spanish-speaking home or whatever it is, we're going to learn that particular language. Or a multilingual home, you're going to learn multiple languages. You have that it doesn't mean you have it already. The instinct to learn a language is not the same thing as knowing the language. Otherwise, babies would be coming out saying hola or hello or whatever, and that would be really weird.
Could you then say that knowledge comes from instinct?
You
Your knowledge from just what your instincts are, because you had nothing to begin with knowledge-wise, and your instincts allow you to then build knowledge and experience.
So that, very good. That helps us. And maybe it was this class we talked about consciousness and how consciousness can emerge from non-conscious. Maybe it was a different class. There may be a way of doing that in the way that some higher order thought theorists, with respect to how does consciousness emerge from non-conscious stuff, like physical stuff, well, maybe it comes from non-conscious thinking first. By parallel, and this is something we'll return to with the philosophy of mind section, perhaps knowledge is possible by growing out of instinct. And how do we get, that's right, we talked about this with experience. How can we make a meaningful experience out of meaninglessness? Well, it emerges. Over time, we can build up enough experiences such that meaning and understanding emerges from what would otherwise be chaos. And the instincts are there, perhaps because of genetics, that enable us to...
kind of like a bridge.
Yeah, I like the bridging notion. Whereas just going from nothing to knowledge seems weird, here you have a slower process in which instinct is the intermediary. That's an interesting possibility, one that Locke, I think, would find appealing.
Could you think without language?
Oh, we'll get to that next time. What do you think? And say it without words. Can you think without language? Well, how often do you always think in words? Like in sentences? Complete sentences? Paragraphs?
If you could, then couldn't babies think, even if they don't remember that, if they don't have language? I mean, animals...
We'll get, and animals too. Animals don't have, well, some might. And then we have to get at what a language counts as. Is a language merely a means of communicating? Because birds communicate. Does that count as a language? So that gets a little bit ahead of ourselves. Bring that up next class. Because if you can't think without language, that's fundamental, and that'll pose a problem. And in fact, there's something called the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis that makes the case that thinking is dependent upon the language you speak. And if you don't speak a language, one of the odd conclusions is, well, then you don't have thoughts. But hold off on that. Okay. Let's get at some of his concepts, because they're not abundantly clear. The first one, this thing is not working. The first one is idea. Don't worry about ideal, although he sometimes uses that. I think in the reading you had for today, that's not in there. This is a central concept in his philosophy, and also for rationalists too. But for Locke, an idea is technically defined and abstractly defined as some immediate object of the mind which it, the mind, perceives and has before it. That's what an idea is for him. The word perception might be a decent synonym for us. We use the word perception kind of in the way that Locke uses idea. And at one point in the text he does mention somewhere that I know I'm not being very clear with my language here. I don't have a lot of examples clarifying what I mean. I'm sorry for that. But then he doesn't clarify it still. He just keeps on using the same words without clarification. I find that amusing. This is important, this notion of immediate. An idea is in your head. And you have direct access to that idea. It's in your mind, in your head, and it is representing what's outside of you. That's what ideas are. You have immediate, no mediation. You just have direct access to that idea. This is not the case with respect to the world, though. Your five senses, I'm going to erase these different distinct meaning, understandings of knowledge. Your five senses do not directly connect you to the world. And in this way, according to Locke, in this way, he is not what's known as a direct realist. He's instead known as an indirect realist. Another term for direct is naive. If I'm a realist, all that means is the ideas I have in my head represent things in the world, like a table, Russell's table, for example, that are really there. And they're what caused me to have the ideas. They don't disappear when I, as a perceiver, leave. Right? They're not mind-dependent. Which is weird that I even have to say this. But there are people who are known as idealists, who argue that all objects like tables and chairs and so forth are mind-dependent. They're idealists as opposed to realists. Now there's two types of realists. An indirect realist is somebody who claims, like Locke does, that ideas are mediators between us and the world. We don't ever get to the world as it is directly. Even though our common sense tells us, yeah, this is reality. How do I know? I see it, smell it, hear it, taste it, touch it. Right? And that's how I know it. That's common sense. But common sense leaves out all sorts of things that we've already covered. What about the role that the experiencer brings to an experience? Such that the way I experience is dependent upon my expectations. Right? If I'm given, what was the example I gave you of that kid who was playing with a glow stick? Did I tell you about the glow stick? And his older brother says, hey, be careful with that glow stick. If it cracks and breaks, it'll burn your flesh because it's acid. Which is not true, but that doesn't matter. That idea is in the kid's mind. And the glow sticks work, when you crack them and then they glow. You know what I'm talking about? It's not acid. It's just, it's magic. I guess it's not acid, but it's something. Probably a little bit of chemicals that get, once it mixes with whatever, then it starts to glow. I'm not sure how it works. But it isn't acid. Nevertheless, this kid has in his expectations that there's acid. He's still playing with it, which is something. And he breaks it, and of course it gets on his face. And what does the child do? Screams as if he's in pain. How could he be wrong? Isn't he in pain? If you feel that you're in pain, aren't you in pain? And wouldn't it be weird if somebody said, which this older brother did, you're not in pain? Shut the hell up. I'm burning. My face is melting off. Of course I'm in pain. Well, he's mistaken about the cause of the pain. The pain was caused by his expectations. That changed the experience. What you see is not always what you get. Direct or naive realism says what you see is what you get. There's no disconnect between your experience and the world. You directly experience it. Well, here seems to be a problem with that.
Could he just have been screaming because he was scared?
Well, he claimed to be in pain. It works the other way, too, because I was pushing a Tonka truck, and I was down a street, and I hit a crack in the sidewalk or whatever, and I flew over the Tonka truck and scratched my chin. But I didn't feel anything. It didn't hurt at the time. But apparently it was bleeding profusely. And I went home, and my mom, she's a good mom, but still, she freaked out. She said, "Oh my God," because it was bleeding everywhere. And I looked down, and then I wept and started crying, and then I felt pain, right? I remember this vividly because it was yesterday. Not kidding. And I started weeping uncontrollably. But I did, it's as if the pain started. By the way, if you ever get kids, or it's a weird way of putting it. If you ever contract the disease of children, just kidding, that's a terrible way of putting it. Although somewhat accurate. If you get them, here's a hint of parenting. If they fall down, hurt themselves, even if it's horrible, like their arm is broken and it's facing the wrong direction, you don't freak out. You say, let's brush that off. And then quickly take them to the emergency room. But you don't have to freak out. Just say, you'll be fine. It's amazing. Amazing the cues that they take from you. As they're looking at you, wondering, how should I respond? Am I in pain? It's a crazy thing. And so that's a problem for the direct realists. If my perceptions get me to reality, then there should be no disconnect. What I see, how I perceive it, ought to be how it is. There's a question. Yes?
Yeah, is it kind of like also, but also like hypnotism would be like, is someone would make you believe that
Oh, yeah.
you're getting
It's kind of like,
burned?
that's right. Have you ever been to like a comedian hypnotist who brings people up, makes them stick their arm out and bark like a chicken or whatever? Or, yeah, that's what that's not an error. That's actually walk around like a chicken but bark. He made somebody do that at this show I saw a while back, and this person would not have otherwise done this, I suspect, unless they were being persuaded in some fashion. So that's kind of related. It's kind of like placebo effects, where you're given a pill that has no, it's like a sugar. There's nothing but sugar in it. But that gives you the idea that affects the pain that you're feeling. And you can actually feel better. So it's the opposite of what I was talking about before. Now I'm aware that there's damage, and that causes me to feel the pain. This is somewhat related. Years ago, I was in college, and there was a fraternity party, and they wanted to bring people into the fraternity. And so they had keg parties and food. And so, of course, you go to these things. It didn't make any sense. The school was so small. Why were there fraternities? But anyway, I went for the beer, and I knew somebody in the fraternity, thankfully. And the guy said, "Hey man, drink from this keg, not that one." Okay, fine. All the other freshmen were drinking from this other keg. After about an hour or so, they were, sort of falling around, drunk, acting as if they were totally drunk, completely drunk. This was prior to the development of the new term crunk, so they had no way of explaining how they felt. Crazy drunk. But thank God now we have crunk to analyze the exact level of one's drunkenness. You know about this word crunk that we could not do without. Anyway, they're crunk. Or am I even using that right? Doesn't matter.
I'd say so.
And they're falling around, whatever else. And then after about an hour or 2 hours of this, whoever's in charge of the party says, "How you guys feeling?" "We're wasted, man," blah, and all that. And then he says, "But you've been drinking." I don't know what he said exactly, but it was, "You've been drinking from O'Doul's." That's what that is. That's non-alcoholic beer. You're not actually drunk. And that's what they look like. They're like, "What? This doesn't make any sense. I feel drunk." How could they be mistaken? It would take, by the way, they were not drunk. O'Doul's has so little alcohol, you'd have to drink. You'd have water poisoning and die before you get any alcohol in it. Do you understand? And it occurred to me, what if they drove home? What if somebody drove home thinking that they were drunk, but they're not, because they're drinking O'Doul's? Could you get arrested for that? Driving while believing you're drunk.
Driving.
It's just but you believe you're drunk. I didn't test this theory. I'm just curious. In any case, that's a long story to get at how a direct perception of reality is flawed. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. So, what if you were drunk, but you thought you were drinking O'Doul's, and then you drove home like that?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, these are all things that you can study on your own time. Officer, I'm doing a philosophical experiment. That's why I am or am not drunk. I'm actually not sure. It's a blind test, double blind. Nobody knows. I suggest not doing that. But yeah, that's another way of looking at it. Okay, let's get into this more. I'm sorry. So, we have indirect access to reality. That is, we perceive reality through our ideas, through our expectations, right? That goes back to our discussion of appearance versus reality. Why things appear the way that they do. And why this table, to go back to Bertrand Russell's example, why does it appear one color to somebody but a different color to another? And we'll get to that with tastes as well. Locke's indirect realism makes some sense of those problems, of how we perceive things differently. First of all, before we even get to that in more detail, how do these objects get ideas into our heads to begin with? He talks about simple and complex ideas. For him, a simple idea is a notion of the world that comes in through one sense modality. So this table, and I think he uses the example of a sugar cube at one point. We'll stick with the table, has a particular color. That's one sense, one simple idea. And it comes in piecemeal. We get single file ideas, he claims. We just don't recognize that it happens one at a time. It just seems like, because we're so used to connecting ideas and corralling them together to form what he'll call complex ideas. We have the shape of the table, another simple idea. The size of the table, the weight of the table, and so forth. All of these simple ideas we construct, combine, and form a complex idea of the table. And we associate these ideas, and again, they happen very, very quickly. And it's pretty straightforward, but it leads to an interesting conundrum. So I have the idea of a sugar cube. It has, because I perceive it. I perceive the whiteness or the brownness, the granularity, the sweetness. Each of those are simple ideas. You combine them together to get a cube of sugar, which is a complex idea. But for empiricists, if I am to have an idea of anything, it has to have originated at some point with experience. If that's true, how is it that we get the idea of a unicorn? Close your eyes and imagine a unicorn. Does everyone have it? How did you get that? Knowing that unicorns don't exist, meaning no one's ever experienced one, how do we have ideas of unicorns?
But people have experienced horns and they've experienced horses. When someone says a unicorn is a horse and it was a horn, then you can experience both and go from there, think back on it and go, okay, well I can combine the two of them together. What if that then give you that?
Does everyone see what he's saying? So we simply associate ideas of things that we have experienced. That's quite simple. That's what he wants to say. He doesn't use the example of a narwhal, but I do. The unicorn of the sea. This is a real thing, by the way. There really are manatee-looking things. This is a tooth, by the way. Do you know that? That long horn? They call that a tooth. A useless tooth, as far as I'm concerned. But that's an amazing creature. Look at that. Anyway, you get an idea of narwhals. There it is. You combine that with an idea of a horse, which, by the way, is itself a complex idea comprised of certain colors, shape, and so forth. Combine that with a pelican or something like that, with the wings, and then a rainbow. Oh, damn it. Why did it do that? It ruined it. There it is. Well, I've ruined it. It went backwards. There's the rainbow. Jumble all that together in your understanding by associating ideas together, and you're left with a unicorn. I took the wings off because, of course, as we all know, unicorns don't have wings. What does?
Pegasus.
Pegasus, which is oftentimes erroneously confused with a unicorn. Pegasus and unicorns are different creatures, correct? Who cares? Neither one of them exist. Why do we debate that? But they are different, and here's one powered by rainbows. So here's how you can get a sense of mythical creatures or mythical things that we've never experienced. In a way that the rationalists, they don't have now an attack on the empiricists because there's nothing magical, so to speak, about empiricists constructing ideas based upon experience as long as they've experienced these simple and complex ideas. And by the way, there's an interesting phenomena that might be helpfully explained by Locke's concepts of simple and complex ideas. And that's where we have, in our minds, connecting the different sense modalities. Remember I talked about a simple idea is one that we get of like vision, specifically of a color. But you can also hear things. That's another simple idea, that sound. Some people connect those ideas. Actually, all of us do in varying degrees. But some people in far greater degrees, like they see the number 2. Every time they see the number 2, it's actually a color. The 2 comes out as green. Or they hear a sound and it makes them see a color. Like Jimi Hendrix, every time he heard F7, F sharp 7 I think it was, or something like that, he saw it as purple, which of course led to his song, Purple Haze. He was presumably a synesthete. That's what that term is. Synesthesia is combining different sense modalities. And likely this developed because our brains, when we were first born, everything is sort of squished together, and our hearing sense modality section in our brain is very, very close to our taste or whatever. And there's some crossover between the two. Right? And you still have a sense of this when you say Mondays are blue, or when you listen to music, you could say, that note was a bit sharp or flat. Notes aren't literally sharp or flat, that's metaphorical. You're combining sense modalities in a way that Locke would talk about of taking in simple ideas and forming them into complex ideas. It's just that in some cases, people who have synesthesia are able to combine these ideas, and it's really kind of an ability, because it's very creative when you look at how these sense modalities overlap. That'll be interesting to us when we look at the developments of language, because some arguments are that how do we come up with words for things? One is that we have sounds that represent the way things look. How can that be? Well, we say that thing looks like this sound. That's synesthetic. And in fact, there's an example of this. A neuroscientist uses the example of this shape here and this shape here. You can't really see it. And one of them is named Booby. Booby. Might as well be Booba. And the other one's named Kiki. And you determine which is which, even though these are made-up words. Which is which, given those images there. Can you tell? I don't know if you all can see these images. Which one's Booba, which one's Kiki?
Booba's top.
This was Booba and that was Kiki? How many think that's true? Yeah, you're all right. For those who didn't raise your hand, you're just sleeping, aren't you? Sometimes there are those who don't see it, but we all then have this kind of synesthetic capacity where this looks like it sounds. That's kind of onomatopoeia example. And we'll talk a little bit about that perhaps when we see how language might have evolved. How is it that we can get words at all? Well, it may be originally that the sounds are connected to the way things looked. And that means that perhaps all of us to some extent had capacity for synesthesia. That's just an interesting aside. Let's move on now to get back to his claims here. So objects give us ideas, which are representations of those things. Now, importantly, he makes this distinction, which was around by the time that Descartes was writing, and Newton. Both of them used this language to some extent. I think Galileo may have been the first to coin the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So this table has certain qualities that give rise to ideas in our minds. What does he mean by primary and secondary? What are examples of primary qualities for Locke? Let's say the table.
It's the qualities that the object holds itself.
Say again?
Qualities that the object has itself.
So what would be examples of the primary ones?
It's like hard, or it's the color,
Not the color.
like,
It's solid.
yeah.
Its particular shape. Exactly. Did you have more to...
I was going to say the weight, mass, shape, height, weight.
All the things that you could measure. So all of that you just said is correct. Think of, for Locke, a primary quality are what you might consider objective. Like mind independent. That is, other perceivers can measure it, and it's objective. It's not dependent upon your experiences, so to speak. Whereas secondary qualities are, and you mentioned color, and actually feel, whether it's hard or not, that's more secondary. Right. Because that's something that the perceiver brings to the experience. Go ahead.
Couldn't that change with perspective? If I'm looking at the table from over here, it looks like it's a couple feet across, whereas you're closer and
Yeah.
a little bit farther.
That's a potential problem for Locke. I want to hold on. That's something that Russell talked about to anticipate George Berkeley, and we'll look at Berkeley next time as a response to this, because Berkeley's going to say, hey, Locke, your distinction between primary and secondary qualities collapses. Everything is really just like a secondary quality. But let me say a little bit more about that first. So if you look at an apple, for example, It's got a certain color, certain smell, a certain taste, but it also has a shape, a number, that's how many apples there are. Whether it's solid or hollow, whether it's extended or whether it's not, whether it's what figure or shape it has, and whether it's moving or not. All of those are primary in that they're mind independent. But the color, the smell, the taste, those things depend upon a perceiver. Tables don't have a smell independent of smellers. Right? Strawberries don't have a taste. They don't come with taste. They come with a shape. They don't even come with a color. Something Plato talked about well before Locke and contemporary theories of perception and vision. And you know this in your physics classes today, perhaps. Colors aren't in objects, right? This $800 shirt isn't. Why the hell was that funny? Weird. So this $2,000 yellow shirt is not really yellow. It's the way that, what's that?
Everything but yellow.
Is that how it works?
Isn't it like every color and that's the one that reflects back because
It's something about
it absorbs everything else?
It's something about how the way that light bounces off the object. But it isn't even just that, because to somebody whose rods and cones might not be working, who may be color deficient or color blind, there's not going to be any yellow at all. There's not going to be any color at all. And if you took a microscope to it, you're actually going to get deeper into it. You're not going to come closer to the truth in the sense that, yeah, here's the yellowness of it. In fact, you're going to get deeper into it and see, oh, it's comprised of particles that are colorless. So color is something that somehow emerges. Whereas, according to Locke, weight, size, shape, motion, rest, and so forth, those are independent of any perceiver. But color, and colors are the weird one, but taste seems obvious to us that that's what we bring to an experience. And you can tell this by looking at, just the same strawberry. Take a bite of it, then brush your teeth. Then take another bite of the same strawberry, and it will taste very different. Nothing in the strawberry has changed. It's you, the perceiver, who has changed. Now, to give you a little bit more detail on what he means by this, and he gives the example of snow. Snow isn't cold in and of itself. That feeling requires a feeler. Or the taste of snow, or whatever. Or the color of a snow, right? Although, go ahead.
Well, snow has to be cold.
It has to be cold.
Because then it wouldn't be snow, it'd be water.
It has to have a temperature.
Yeah.
That may be objective and measurable, and I think Locke would be okay with that. But the way it feels, that's in the mind of a perceiver. The coldness. It has to be a certain temperature, which is different. Because in your text, they give an example of this as a potential problem, but we can see how it might be useful to make sense of what Locke is trying to say. The buckets of water example.
3 waters.
Yeah, what page is that? Page 61, yeah. You've got hot water on one side, cold water on the other side, then room temperature water or tepid water in the middle. If you put your hands in the two extremes, this one's in cold water, this one's in hot water. You take the hand that's in cold water and put it in the room temperature water, that water's going to feel hot. You take the other hand, in the same water, it's going to feel cold. Same water, the same temperature objectively has different feels. The feeling of it, we bring to the experience. The color, we bring to the experience. The taste, we bring... There's Hank. It's jumping ahead. We bring to the experience. The primary qualities, as he puts it, they cause us to have ideas in our heads, and those ideas are resemblances or representations of what's out there. Of patterns, as he puts it, that really exist in those objects. All he means by that is, this truly does have this shape, whether or not I'm the one looking at it. This truly does have this weight, whether I'm the one trying to lift it. But it doesn't have the smell or the taste, independent of tasters or smellers. If there were no conscious beings in the universe, but there was still this table, then the smell of the table, it would be a meaningless question to ask, what does it smell like? Which, by the way, takes us to that wonderful phrase, finally we can get to it, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? There are wavelengths, right? Sound can be determined based upon frequency fluctuations. But how it sounds, right? The perception of sound, like the perception of tasting something, is something that experiencers bring to the situation. So, with respect to the secondary qualities, put it another way, you can take away the secondary qualities of some object without destroying the object. If you took away the primary qualities, then you'd be left with nothing. If you took away the shape, the solidity, extension, and so forth, you're fundamentally changing the thing in question. But when you hold your nose and eat a strawberry, you've taken away the taste. You haven't taken away the strawberry. That's the easiest example to make sense of primary and secondary. Secondary are mind-dependent. That's the phrase you should know. A secondary quality depends upon minds. Primary qualities are mind-independent. Does everyone see that distinction? Any questions on that? I think we're about out of time if we wanted to have room for a quiz, and I do want to have room for a quiz. So let me take a moment here. Any questions on what we just covered? I think we covered enough. Yeah. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. Well, we'll have about 12 minutes or so to do this quiz, which is plenty of time. Everything off your desk except your Scantron, the small Scantrons. If you have the big one, that's fine.